Okay, good afternoon and good evening, or good morning actually, to many of you. Thank you again for joining us on our second day of the International Conference on Media in Education, or ICoME 2022 Hawaii. And unfortunately, we weren't able to coordinate it so that we could physically have it here and have us all interacting together. So therefore, with help from our graduate students and with Kirihino, we've also included GatherTown as a platform for people to interact with one another. So this is our second day, and the highlight for today will be a keynote, followed by a series of concurrent sessions. And I'm sure that you'll find the topics to be very interesting and engaging and hopefully memorable in your experience at ICoM. This event is brought to you with the help of faculty associations in Japan, in Korea, in China, and among us at an organization that we call TCC, which is a nonprofit organization in Hawaii that works with the University of Hawaii College of Education, Educational Technology, Learning Design and Technology uh, department. And also we have been very fortunate to have assistance and production help with our Zoom platform from a company called Learning Times in New York, which is headed by John Walber and Hope Candell. We have worked with them for more than a decade in doing some of these online events. So with that, I want to turn the floor over to Seungoh Paek for to deliver to us a keynote address, the title of which is called Distance in Learning, as you can see on our title slide. And I just want to mention that Professor Peck is a colleague of mine and has had a very interesting background in terms of her education, coming to Hawaii most recently from Columbia University. And my understanding is being raised and starting her educational career as well in Korea. And I believe that's where she is at the moment. So with that, Seungoh, let me turn the floor over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Bert Kimura. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the second day of ICoME 2022. And my name is Seungoh Paek, and I'm a professor in the Department of Learning Design and Technology at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. So before I begin, I'd like to thank the ICoME committee for the opportunity to speak today. And thanks to all of you for taking the time to attend these sessions. It is an honor to be here with such a scholarly and international group. Okay, so I'd like to take the next 40 minutes to talk about the concept of distance in learning and how various technical and non-technical factors are changing how we think about and how we work with some of the core elements of teaching and learning. My talk today is divided into 4 sections. In the first sections, I'd like to introduce the main idea of the talk, that there are different kinds of distance that exist within a learning experience. We'll do this by drawing on the elements of the instructional core. The next 3 sections will describe projects I've been involved in that focus on innovative learning environments that have intentionally and sometimes accidentally alter the distance in the learning experience by students and/or instructors. So let's get started. Part 1, distance and the instructional core. Previously, I mentioned this talk is about the concept of distance in teaching and learning. Now, when I say teaching and learning, I mean anything and everything that involves some kind of exchange of concepts and practices. This means anything from a kindergarten classroom to a ski lesson, from an undergrad chemistry class to a corporate training workshops. My hope is that at least one of the ideas shared today will resonate with you, providing a new lens for thinking about what's possible when it comes to designing learning experiences in a post-COVID world. Given the challenges many of us face due to the pandemic, I think it is particularly relevant for groups of educators like us to step back and think about the role of distance in learning. For many, the pandemic ushered in what's been called emergency remote teaching. So what was the impact of the pandemic? Well, here's what the headlines tell us about the state of education. The pandemic has had devastating impacts on learning. What will it take to help students catch up? The biggest disruption in the history of American education. But we know American education is not the only education system disrupted by the pandemic. This is a disaster. Severity of learning loss to the pandemic comes into focus. The COVID-19 pandemic has changed education forever, and this is how. If you look past these sensational headlines, it is clear there are a lot of concerns, worries, and fears about distance and online learning. At the same time, however, there is an increasing sense of that online and distance learning paradigms are here to stay. Accordingly, I prepared this talk based on the premise that there is increased or renewed interest in new learning paradigms. As we continue contemplating what those new or alternative paradigms might be, I want to suggest or propose the concept of distance in learning as a useful perspective for us to think about all forms of formal and informal education. As a way talking about distance in learning, I want to introduce you to the concept of the instructional core. The instructional core is a concept developed by Richard Elmore from Harvard University. As you can see here, the instructional core is composed of three interdependent components. The first component is teachers' knowledge and skill. The second component is students' engagement in their own learning. And third component is academically challenging content. Elmore argued that it is the relationship between these components that determine the nature of instructions and learning. It is not the qualities of any one of these components by themselves. Again, it is the relationship between them. In fact, Elmore wrote, there are only three ways to improve students' learning. You can raise the level of the content the students are taught. You can increase the skill and knowledge that teachers bring to the teaching of that content. And you can increase the level of a student's active learning of that content. That's it. Everything else is instrumental. Of course, we know there are many important peripheral components that push and pull on the instructional core. For example, school cultures surround the instructional core and influences. There's also parents and home life. And of course, we have politics, economics, and technology. But to keep things simple, let's set those aside for now. And let's focus on these three components so we can talk about the importance of the distance between them. We can explore this idea by asking three questions. What's the distance between students and teacher? What is the distance between teacher and content? And what's the distance between students and content? Now, you might be wondering, what do I mean by distance? Well, in the literature, it has been argued there are a number of dimensions to distance. First, we have the obvious dimensions of place and or space. Next, we have the dimensions of time. Third, we have dimensions of language. And fourth, we have the dimensions of cultures. Now, today, I want us to combine these dimensions of distance with the instructional core. So we might get something that looks like this. Combining this concept in this way gives a useful framework for thinking about how various educational decisions impact the distances between the components of the instructional core. To make this more concrete, let's take a look at a few examples. Here is an example from the past, an apprenticeship. Here we have a single student, a single teacher working in an authentic context to learn the concept and practices of particular content area. In this case, a trade, blacksmithing, cobbling, and glass blowing. From a distance perspective, it is pretty clear the distance between the three components is minimized, certainly in terms of space and time, and possibly along the dimensions of language and culture as well. What about small school in a rural part of the country? In this example, we have multiple students who have likely traveled a physical distance to get to school. The teacher may or may not be a member of the community, which may impact the distance between the students and teachers. And now that we have multiple students, the odds of increasing distance along the dimensions of language and culture may change. And think about the distance between the students and content. Compared to our apprenticeship model, the introductions of a more formal curriculum consisting of reading, writing, and math may have altered the distance between students and content. Our next example is pre-pandemic college lecture. What distance values might we assign to this example of teaching and learning? Obviously, the physical distance of the teacher and students is relatively close given the large room, meaning at least they are all in the same room. But what about the other dimensions of distance? If we estimate 100 students in the class, there are bound to be some differences in language and culture. So now let's jump to a typical classroom in the middle of the pandemic. How did going 100% online under emergency circumstances impact the distances between the components of the instructional core? We know for sure that pandemic-related lockdown changed the distance dimensions of place. It may have also impacted the dimensions of time, changing when students and teachers were able to meet and hold classes. I know we all have met with our students on Sunday night during the pandemic. Just because the people on this example are not in the same physical space, can we say there's a more distance between teacher and students? Is there a more distance between students and content? Think about all of the e-learning materials the students have access to beyond the limited class time in Zoom. What about language and culture? In terms of language, many of us quickly developed a new shared vocabulary where Zoom was now a thing we can do. Let's Zoom, as well as a place, let's meet in Zoom. Okay, so I hope you get the idea behind thinking about these three components of the instructional core and distances between them. Personally, I have found this to be a useful framework for thinking about my own teaching and course design. And now, what I like to do is share some example of learning environments that I have thought about in terms of the distance in learning experienced by students and or instructors. Example 1, studio-based learning. So the first example is a class I have been teaching with my graduate students at the University of Hawaii and Manoa. This course was designed to introduce doctoral students to the field of instructional design. Now, in general, these PhD students are smart and motivated and can learn things quickly, but they may have little to no knowledge of experience with the field of instructional design. So how might we design a course that would properly introduce these capable students to instructional design? As my department thought about these questions, we start with identifying a number of challenges related to teaching instructional design. One of those challenges has to do with the balancing theory, practicum, and research within a single course. As you may know, instructional design is very much focused on actually doing or practicing instructional design. Yet actually engaging instructional design should be based on theories related to teaching and learning, as well as current research. How can we cover all this in one course while students practice instructional design? Another challenge is the balance between breadth and depth. Should students be exposed to multiple instructional design models, or should they engage with a single model for an extended period of time? Still, another challenge has to do with the choice of using real-world cases versus academic cases. Real-world cases are often complex and nuanced, yet it isn't always possible to use them in a class for various practical reasons. On the other hand, some academic cases, which are specifically designed for a class, might be more practical, but may not be as engaging and/or relevant to our students. So how do we design a course that balances all of these competing priorities? They are all important. To that question, our solutions was to design a class based on studio-based learning, SBL. SBL is an inquiry apprenticeship model. It emphasizes a shared learning environment in which ambiguous problems are addressed through analysis, propositions, and critique. It has been used in diverse content areas from physics to creative writing. Before I introduce our studio class, I'd like to take a minute to consider the meaning of the word studio. As shown here, studio can mean a class, a space, or pedagogical methods of instruction. The idea of studio as class refers to providing long blocks of time in which students work on authentic design problems while developing their expertise. Studio as a space refers to a physical or virtual environment where students are encouraged to work. There's usually space for displaying visual artifacts and works in progress, and collaborations and interactivity are emphasized. Studio as pedagogy refers to an instructional style involving project-based assignments followed by public presentations of students' work for critique. Such an approach presents the students with the design problems grounded in the realities of professional practice and expect them to work individually or in groups to solve those problems. With this understanding of studio in mind, we designed an instructional design studio class known as LTEC 701. In this class, our PhD students take on the role of instructional designer to work for a real client, who in this case is a faculty member from our department. More specifically, the PhD students in this case have to design a course based on the needs of the real client. It just so happened that that client is me. And the project they have to work on is redesigning a master's level instructional design course. This requires them to understand the theory, practice, and research behind the original instructional design course. While there are many aspects of this instructional design studio class that I can talk about, maybe in another context, one thing that I like to emphasize as critical is that in this class, my role varies between instructor, client, mentor, and subject matter experts. And students meet with me in all of these roles. In addition, students also take on multiple roles. There are students, of course, but they are also working as instructional designers, media developers, and subject matter experts. So now that you know a little bit about the course, let's circle back to the premise of this distance in the instructional core. In other words, how does a studio-based learning model impact the distances within the instructional core? I would argue that this course and its use of studio-based learning impacted the distance of all three components of the core. However, if I had to pick the one that changed the most, I would choose the student-teacher distance. This was due to the number of different ways students could approach me as the teacher. At different times, I'll meet with students as their instructor, as their client, and as a subject matter expert. Knowing they could meet with me in a number of different ways helped make me more approachable, thus reducing the distance between students and teacher. One thing I want to note is that I have taught the studio class in both face-to-face and online settings. Despite this difference, the instructional design competence levels that students have shown after the course were almost the same and even higher for students in the online studio class. This suggests that regardless of the delivery format, face-to-face or online, the studio-based learning approach reduced the distance between teacher and students and maybe have been a key factors in the success of the course. To summarize, I believe this one example of how design decision can be thought about in terms of distance and the instructional core. So that's one example, and let's take a look at another example, this time focusing on simulation-based learning. This example involves a different target audience and new content area. The target audience in this time is middle school students, and the content area is social studies. Research has shown students often feel disconnected from their social studies lessons. They often find it hard to relate to social study topics dealing with beyond immediate local experience. Despite this reality, we know there's increased emphasis in education to prepare young people to be globally oriented. That's because our lives are becoming increasingly mixed economically, politically, and culturally. So how can we design a learning experience to help students become more globally competent? First, we need to understand global competence. What is global competence? Well, one group defined it as the ability to contribute to knowledge as well as comprehend, analyze, and evaluate its meaning in the context of increasingly globalized world. Of course, developing global competence in middle school students creates a pretty big challenge for educators. For sure, it is not an easy task. In fact, researchers have argued that cultivating global citizenship requires teachers to have a global perspective, model cultural sensitivity, and engage students in educational activities aimed at developing global citizenship. In addition, it has been suggested that schools need to restructure curriculum and pedagogy to create opportunity for students to understand how their actions are embedded in a larger global context. To help address this need, I have been involved in a project called Sympholicon. Sympholicon stands for the simulations of political and economic development. It was originally created by Danny Dates, a lifelong social study teacher working in California. Recently, Mr. Dates has been working with a number of people to redesign Sympholicon. So let me tell you a little bit about how this online simulations work. In Sympholicon, every student leads a single virtual country in a simulated world. As a national leader, students have to make decisions about economic development, international relations, and environmental sustainability. The challenge is to provide for their countries unlimited economic wants while limiting pollution and preparing for natural disaster, public health issues, military conflicts, and other real-world issues. Once assigned a country, students must rank order 12 national goals. These goals vary from achieving high GDP to developing military strength to limiting pollution. With their national goals set, students must then explore their starting resources, which consist of hand tool, unskilled labor, some land, and mineral deposit. Using these basic resources, they must begin to develop their country. One of the first things students realize is that their first priority needs to be creating enough food and water to feed the citizens of their countries, which is start with a 100% deficit in food and water. Thus, one of the main mechanics in Sympolicon is productions, where students combine different resources to produce new products and goods. In this example, the player is creating 100 units of fish, a source of protein for feeding people. In total, there are over 200 goods and resources that can be produced. Some of those resources are human resources, such as teachers and doctors. Other goods are producer goods, such as small machines and wire. Soon enough, the students realize that they don't have all of the natural resources they need to develop their country. Therefore, they need to exchange things with other countries, and the trade screen allows countries to trade products and goods with other countries. This can be done openly or anonymously. Finally, Sympolicon contains a world briefing screen that provides students a bird's eye view of what's happening in their country compared to other countries. This view encourages a sort of shifting between national and international perspectives. What's happening at the national level may or may not mirror what's happening globally. So now that you know a little bit about Sympolicon, let's link back to the concept of the instructional core and how shared simulated world might be impacting the distance within the instructional core. Well, like the studio-based learning, I think it could be argued that simulation-based learning enabled by Sympolicon impacts the distance of all of the components of the core. However, if I had to pick the distance that changed the most, I would pick the distance between students and content. Here are some observations that support this claim. First, while Sympolicon is designed to be a multiplayer experience, each student plays simulations on their own computers as the leader of single countries such as Germany or China. Yet many students realize how important it was for a country to coordinate their efforts internationally. There's something about the virtual world that Sympolicon creates that encourages students to dialogue and discuss. In one example, multiple countries came to the aid of a single country that could not feed its people. In another instance, countries formed an alliance that prevented trading with a country that continued to develop military resources, besides a treaty banning military development. These examples were completely unscripted and initiated by the students themselves. In terms of learning, a concept mapping exercise shows changes in students' concept maps before and after playing the simulation for 1 week. The concept map represents students' understanding of the features and actions of successful country. As you can see here, the concept maps glue in terms of the number of nodes, as well as in their number of connections between nodes. Here's another example. This example shows not only the number of the nodes and connectors increase, but also increasing complexity of the maps, as one node was connected to several other related nodes. In short, we observed how the simulation made the interdisciplinary content of social studies, which too often consists of memorizing facts, more concrete, meaningful, and relevant. In other words, by taking on the role of being an active role of a country, students were able to experience more closely what it means to lead and make hard choices related to development. So this is an example of using simulation-based learning model as a way to reduce the distance between students and content, in this case, social studies content. I believe this is a strong example of how technology can be integrated into lessons in ways that alter the distance between the course component. And finally, I want to focus on culture-based learning. In this example, I want to introduce yet another target audience and content area. This time, the target audience is upper elementary teachers, and the content area is computer science. So let me talk a little bit about the challenges behind this project first. Like many places around the world, Hawaii aims to provide computer science opportunities to all of its students. However, a recent report found that only 14% of Hawaii students were enrolled in a CS course last year. So there's a lot of room for improvement to get to 100%. One of the reasons for low enrollment in computer science is the Department of Education does not have enough qualified teachers, especially at the elementary level. In addition, the teachers that do teach CS often face a number of challenges. Those challenges include little exposure to the field of CS, minimal formal training and how to actually teach CS, all kinds of pedagogical challenges, and an overall lack of community. Given this situation, the desire of offer CS to all students in Hawaii and the lack of qualified CS teachers, my colleague, Dr. Hoffman, Dr. Leong, and Dr. Ka'aloa, some of which are here today, decided to think about a possible solution to this challenge. The idea we came up with is to offer professional development in the area of cultural relevant computing. Now, in order to understand cultural relevant computing, we need to first talk about cultural relevant pedagogy. Cultural relevant pedagogy is an approach to teaching that uses students' cultural knowledge and background to help them learn. According to Lawson Billings from the University of Wisconsin, this teaching approach affirms students' cultural identities while assisting them in developing critical perspectives that challenges inequities in schools and other institutions. Now, Lawson Billings argued that cultural relevant pedagogy promotes the three areas of students' development: learning and achievement, cultural competence, and critical consciousness. The first area is learning and achievements, which is defined as a student's intellectual growth and moral development, as well as their ability to problem solve and reason. This, of course, is not unique to a cultural relevant pedagogy. The second area is cultural competence. Cultural competence are the skills that support students to form and appreciate their culture of origins while developing fluency in at least one other culture. And the third area, critical consciousness, is defined as the ability to identify, analyze, and solve real-world problems, especially those that result in societal inequalities. Okay, so now that we know a little bit about cultural relevant pedagogy, let's talk about the concept of cultural relevant computing. Cultural relevant computing examines how computing can be embedded in cultural activities. It aims to use students' prior knowledge to learn content and provide opportunities for social and civic empowerment. In other words, cultural relevant computing focuses on how students can use computers to engage with and improve the world around them. And critically, cultural relevant computing positions learning about culture in and of itself as a desired outcome. In this way, learning about culture is just as important as learning about computing. With these ideas in mind, my colleagues and I decided to design and deliver professional development for elementary teachers in Hawaii. We chose the elementary teachers as they are the groups with the highest need of support. Specifically, we designed a 3-day workshop with the goal of introducing these teachers to concept and practice of cultural relevant computer science. The workshop itself was comprised of 2 key components. The first component was an example of cultural relevant computing modules. These draft modules were designed by our team and consist of multiple lessons. The modules focused on different combinations of CS and cultural concepts and practices and were meant to be a vehicle for dialogue and learning. The second of components of the workshop was demonstrations of the culturally relevant computing modules. Importantly, some of the demonstrations were whole group and facilitator-led, whereas other were small group and participant-led. The purpose was to provide an experience to build shared understanding, facilitate dialogue, and learn together about cultural relevant computing. As shown here, one of the modules consists of 5 individual lessons. One of the lessons from that module was taught to the participants by one of our team members. After experiencing that demo lesson, the teacher participants were asked to teach the next 2 lessons of the module. Participants were free to use the lesson as is or modify them in ways that would work for their students. After the shared experience of module, we asked the participants a number of reflection questions, such as, what did you notice about the cultures being represented in this demo? And how do you think your students will react to this lesson? The goal was to collect pedagogical and practical feedback about the modules. So now that we talked a little bit about the professional development workshop that used the culture-based learning model, let's link back to the concept of distance in the instructional core. How did emphasizing cultural relevance impact the distance between the core components of students, teacher, and content? By design, the workshop seemed to reduce the distance between the teachers and the content of cultural relevant computing. And we know this based on the result of survey administered to the teacher participants at the end of the workshop. This survey was retrospective and asked 4 questions. Participants were tasked with self-reporting their level of agreements with each statement before and after the workshop. They did this using 5-point Likert scale. As you can see here, all 4 areas increased as a result of the workshop. But what surprised us the most was the response to the second item. I am knowledgeable about computer science concepts and practices. This surprised us because we did not directly teach about CS concept or practices. The workshop was about cultural relevant computing. However, there was something about the topic that helped the teachers feel closer to the target content area. In other words, the culture-based learning model became a vehicle to introduce the content of CS to teachers, ultimately reducing the distance between them and the CS content area. Okay, that was the third and final example, and we're just about out of time, I believe. So what I like to do now is use the last few minutes to recap what we've discussed and highlight the connection to the conference theme of moving on with e-learning today, tomorrow, and the future. We start out today's session learning about the 3 components of the instructional core. I then argue that thinking about the distance between these components is a useful exercise for analyzing learning design decisions. From there, we learned about multiple dimensions of distance, including place, time, language, and culture. By combining these dimensions with the instructional core, we ended up with a new framework, one that can be used to reflect upon the impact of various design decisions related to teaching and learning. We then applied the new framework to a number of hypothetical examples. And ultimately, we looked at 3 real-world projects involving specific design decisions: a studio-based learning model, a simulation-based learning model, and a culture-based learning model. Each time, we step back to think about the impact of the model on the distance of the instructional core. Whether your work involves e-learning, online learning, distance learning, or even good old-fashioned face-to-face learning, my hope is that at least one of the ideas or examples shared today has resonated with you. There are 101 ways to design and implement learning experiences, and there are many different ways to reflect on those experiences. One way to reflect on teaching and learning is to keep in mind the instructional core and the distance between its components especially as new technology and challenges emerge. The goal, of course, for all of us to reflect continuously on how to make learning experience as effective, efficient, and meaningful as possible as we move forward with e-learning and other forms of education. And thank you. With that, I will stop and open up the floor for questions. And I think I spent probably 40 minutes to talk. So should I stop share so that we can have conversation?
Thank you very much for this very interesting and inspiring talk. Let's see if anyone has any questions for you. Either you may type it into the chat, or feel free to raise your hand and or unmute yourself and share your video as well. And we can have a sort of a simulated, I guess, face-to-face conversation. Questions, anyone?
Ari?
Oh, Dr.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Hi, Seungoh.
Hi,
Thanks for
Ari.
that. Hi. So I have a question. You know, the three different examples, you had three different distances. I'm wondering if you feel like there's some kind of a sweet spot where there's maybe a blend of all three, perhaps?
So distance on 3.
Mm-hmm.
So I was actually thinking like apprenticeship models, like for example, that I shared, right? This is very ideal model when you think about like very reduced distance, right? There's a reduced distance between teachers and students content and teachers, right? So it is very ideal model, but that's not probably practical model when we are thinking about our classrooms with the 20-something students and the curriculum that teachers have to cover. So, you know, maybe ideal situations, maybe with the advanced technology, we might be able to bring the apprenticeship models back. But I think the core idea is that actually to reduce the distance between all threes is that, like, I think there is like I think one example is still based, like no clear, like you are teachers and you are the students, right? And then there's like, this is the content that you have to memorize, right? So I think there should be some sort of, even though those 3 instructional core, like the essential core, I think there is some, there should blur like roles between these teachers and students. And then there is blurred the content, right? It's that this is not only content we have to cover, right? During the Sympolicons, right, we try to teach this content. We saw the students are talking about this content, right? So it's not like you have to limit the contents of the teaching or instructions, and right? I think it should be broad, expanded, the what can be covered in terms of the content. So again, I think there are 3 essential core components that we need to think about, but I think the line between them should be a little bit blurry to reduce the distance between 3 components. I don't know if I make if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
Thank you, Ari. I think
Okay, we've got a few more questions. Go ahead, Professor Bailey.
Hi, Seungoh.
Hi.
This is Danilo. Yeah. So, in the last model that you presented, you talk about the changes, before the workshop and after the workshop. And I'm just curious if you collected more qualitative data, because you said practices and concepts, and so they're very broad. What I mean, and so. Given that your N is 16, I was just curious if there were more, or you think you need to follow up and really tease out what are those things that made a difference, because the 16 people could have, different ways of concepts that they learned, or the practices that really stuck with them. So just a curiosity, given that.
Good questions. Actually, we just finished that PD. It's like a month ago, I think. So Dr. Peters and Dr. Dancy here, so they can talk about this workshop too. But that we collected a lot of qualitative data. So basically, all 3 days workshops are recorded, and all the conversations and discussion that we have probably somewhere we recorded. And then, of course, after those 3 days workshop, we had a focus group interviews. So we have 6 participants all participate in a focus group interview. We haven't had a chance to analyze that data yet, but we know and we believe there's a rich data that we can actually support our claim that somehow our culturally relevant computing workshops make them to feel more comfortable with the computer science practices, the content and practices. We were somewhat surprised at how teachers, how much teachers expressed that they feel comfortable to think about or to continue teaching computer science after the 3 days workshop. 3 days workshop went by very fast, and I was like, what can we do for only the 3 days, right? But we were pleasantly surprised at how much teachers feel more related to or comfortable with the computer science after the 3 days workshop. And we hope to, we are planning to analyze all those qualitative data and hopefully share with you guys more the result in another conference, another setting. Oh, also, I have to mention that one of the goal of the workshop is not just 1 year and end it there, like one workshop and end it there. We are trying to build the community so that we can continuously support these the CS elementary school teachers. So we are going to continue. We're definitely going to follow up with these teachers, and then hopefully they will join us in our 2nd year of the professional development. Thank you, Daniela, for
Thank you,
questions.
Professor Leon.
Hey, Seungoh.
Peter.
Hi, Peter. Hi, Dr. Peter.
Yeah. All right. So I'm always so impressed when I hear my colleagues present at keynotes and all that. Thank you for bringing this fresh perspective. I'm curious with your 4 dimensions of distance here. We are more acquainted with place, with time, somewhat with language and culture. So this is something that that we talk a lot about in our grant project. Is how do you see the conceptualization of the construct of culture here, specifically when you talk about as it relates to the instructional core? I mean, and the obvious thing is the ethnic culture, national cultures, but also we talked a lot about the culture of the internet or the pop culture factor.
Right. So obviously, like building, kind of having the common sense of cultures, like is challenging, right? Like how we can reduce the cultures, the distance between the cultures among like multiple students, right? Like elementary school probably 20 students, and in some classes more than 20s and 25s. And when I was in elementary school, I was in the class of 60s students in one class. So definitely, it's building kind of reducing the distance between cultures among students. It's a challenging work, and especially considering all the prior knowledge that students would bring to the table, to the classroom. So we actually have several, actually not several, but we have worked with some of the teachers to understand how they're dealing with the different cultures among their students. And I think what they really emphasize is really building the trust and between the students and teachers, and then so that they are not coming from the same culture for sure, right? But they are bringing their cultures, and then it's the safe place for them to share their cultures, right? So with that understanding, I think they're building their own kind of culture, like classroom cultures, right? If this is a safe place to share this, and we can talk anything, right? And I think that's the key for building, reducing the distance between cultures.
Thank you. Well said.
I hope that answers.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Dan.
Me? Thanks. So the point that I wanted to make, I actually wanted to connect back to Aries' really interesting question about this notion of, is there some ideal middle ground within the instructional core, the distances within the instructional core? And I think that's really interesting to think about. And as I wondered a little bit about that, I suspect that there's actually that the ideal distances are not static, and that the instructional core is constantly adapting to the current context. And I think that vision is actually underlying movements like the personalized learning movement, or the idea behind computer adaptive learning software. I think both of those are examples of trying to leverage technology to try to constantly adjust the distances of the instructional core to keep the students engaged, and adapting the instruction and adapting the content to keep some ideal middle ground that you're imagining, Ari. So I just wanted to share that, as I thought it was kind of an interesting connection, and a really interesting question, Ari. Mahalo.
Thank you. Dr. Dylan.
Then Nilo has another questions.
Okay. This is maybe related to what Dan is saying, because when you presented the instructional core, you got the teacher, student, and content. But what's interesting, in an online environment, we tend to capitalize on beyond the teacher and beyond the student himself or herself, but also with other students. So have you thought about that possibility, that instructional core is more than just those three components, and there are other components that impact, the learning process? Just curious.
Yes, for sure, right? There are, like, that's the kind of the essential, like, that's why we call the core, like, I guess I don't, Richard Elmore called the instructional core, right? So in instruction, there are many factors that you have to consider, right? But the main players or main core of the instructions, the teachers and students, and the content. Well, of course, I think with all this new technology, new learning environments, new instructional models, like as Dan mentions now, like personalized learning is being very focused. So like I can see there are many more factors, like many more elements will add on to this the triangle, and then probably don't keep this triangle anymore, right? As you can see in my example, the triangle doesn't stay as a triangle, right? So as we're trying to reduce the distance between these components, right? So I think of the more components will add on to the instructional core, and then I also showed us a few like other factors like influence this instructional core, and then there will be more, right? But I don't know if it's gonna change the essential, these three components, right? I can see more components will be added onto the instructional core, but I don't know if anything is going to replace one of the components. For example, something is going to replace teachers. I'm not sure. If it's going to something is going to replace the students, I don't think so, right? So that's how I see it. So I think I always think that when we reflect our teaching and learning, I think it's always good to go back to the basic, right? Step back and think about what we are trying to do when we teach, when we learn, right? And then I somehow believe these three components are the basic that we cannot miss. We have to think about, and then I'm not sure this will be replaced by something else. I don't know if that's the question that we're asking. Did I answer your question?
I think you did. What's interesting for me is that you are providing uh, uh, a perspective, a framework, and I think that's great because we go back to the literature. However, given my own experiences working with a different culture, those elements changes, or the roles changes, and so like in the Philippines, students are very strong in terms of that, but still the teacher is there. It's just that the role of the teacher either shifts or minimized given, access to the learning space. So I just a comment on that. I don't think that, I think it's great that, you got this, and it helps really, people who are coming to distance education is able to, um, place themselves, in understanding what's happening. But as you said, what I mean, or as Dan said, the technology available to us, like you just think about 10 years ago when Zoom is not available. You know what I mean? How, how these three components has shifted. But now with technology adding to the mix, it has really shifted, how these three interacts. So thank you for providing that perspective.
Yeah, oh, no, thank you for your comments. So I can see you are mentioning the hexagons or more, right? So there are definitely more components, and then will be added to the current instructional reports. And then here, I think Dr. Menchaca, Dr. Mike also say AI could be students and teachers and or content. So also wonder how that components fit. So I think that's an interesting comments. And then definitely technology is the main, is kind of driving some of the changes that we can't make. Like meaning we can make some of changes because of the technology. We can do this online teaching and learning because of the Zoom or because of the other online tools, right? So definitely technology, for example, is an important component that we may have to add to the, like as a one, the fourth components there. But I guess that's a more debatable questions, is that the technology is the tool that we can consider as a second layer of this instructional core, or is the components, that the action store components within this instructional core. I'm not sure, and as a person who studied instructional technology, I'm not against adding technology into about the essential the components, but something that for us to think about. I think Ari, you raised hands for a long time.
Yeah,
Sorry.
I did. Oh no, it's fine. I had another question while you were talking, Bert. I know that we have to go in 3 minutes, so I will try to make it very quick. But you mentioned that there, in the instructional design studio, that there was less distance between you and the students. But I'm also kind of wondering, it's so interesting in that studio that students take on so many roles. They're students, they're designers, and then they're also teachers because they're designing instruction. And I wonder if somehow their experience is deeper because of that, and therefore is the distance to the content perhaps also lessened?
Definitely. I think actually that's kind of the blurs the kind of relationship between the teachers and the students. So for example, when I'm the client, they they actually have to act like they know more than me, right? So I'm like discussing, I'm having this difficulty of doing this and do this, give me the solutions, right? And then they have to go back and discuss it within the team and come back with the solutions. So I think that's it's not just multiple hats that I had, but the multiple hats that they have to play on. Definitely each was the key of the reducing the distance between those content of the students and teachers. Thank you for that.
That's super interesting.
Pointing out that. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone. And thank you very much for your very inspiring and
thank you for listening.
Thought-provoking presentation as well. I'd like to suggest that all of us that are available switch over to GatherTown, and at least if you have the chance, please say hello and greet everyone. And while we're doing that, several of us need to open up the other rooms so that we can begin with the concurrent sessions that will begin in about 16 minutes, if I have my time correct. So thank you again, and thank you everyone for joining us today.
Thank
and
you.
a virtual round of applause through the reaction, or simply just turn on your video. Thank you again. Thank you, Seungoh. Good to hear your voice as well.
Thank you again for the opportunity. Thank you.